In the September of 480 BC, a Persian king named Xerxes sat on a marble throne above the bay of Salamis and watched his fleet sail into the narrow channel from which he could not escape. He had brought the throne because he wanted to watch his victory in comfort. He had brought scribes because he wanted to record the names of his own captains who would be the bravest, so he could reward them after their surrender. By the end of the day, his fleet was wrecked, his army was trapped on the wrong side of the Aegean Sea, and the man who had believed himself the agent of destiny was riding home through Thrace in the rain. Well, Xerxes had what every losing commander in this series has had from Marathon to Normandy was faith. Faith that the gods favored them, faith that history was on his side, faith that the size of their army was proof the outcome had already been written. In 2,500 years of recorded military history, that faith has been the most reliable predictor of defeat we have. This is the closing episode. We have walked 16 battles. The question is, what did we find? I am Benito, and this is the Jacked Historian channel. For any one of you who came in late, here is what we covered. We began at Marathon in 490 BC and Salamis 10 years later, where a coalition of Greek city-states broke the largest empire on earth. We went to Gaugamela in 331 BC, where Alexander cut a wedge through the Persian center and ended the empire Salamis had only wounded. We did the Punic Wars, Cannae and Zama, the battles that made Rome the thing the world had not seen before. Then Adrianople in 378, where a Roman emperor died in the dust and the Western Empire never recovered. We did Tours, we mentioned a little bit of the Battle of Yarmouk, and the two battles that fixed the religious geography of the Mediterranean for 1,000 years and counting. Then we went to Hastings in England in 1066, where one arrow on a hill in Sussex made England a different country. We did the Battle of Hattin in 1187, where Crusaders' kingdoms in the Holy Land were broken by a single afternoon. A battle that almost never makes the famous lists, but should. We did Constantinople in 1453, where one of the longest-running political institutions on earth was extinguished by a cannon. The Spanish Armada, later in 1588, where the largest fleet of the earlier modern age was beaten by weather, gunnery, and the refusal of a small Protestant island to accept that it had to be Catholic. We went to Vienna in 1683, where the Ottoman tide that had been rising since Constantinople was finally turned. Then in the New World, Saratoga in 1777, where an American victory turned a colonial rebellion into a global war. Waterloo in 1815, Gettysburg 1863, then the Battle of the First Marne in 1914, where the war nobody wanted and everyone got was locked into the shape that would define the rest of the century, with its Stalingrad and finally Normandy. 16 battles. I planned initially 15, the list moved and shifted around in the process of making it. The 16th forced its way in. Some battles I planned at the start got swapped for others, and because I came to believe were more important. That is how these series go. You start with a plan and the work reshapes that plan. That is also, as it happens, part of what the series turned out to be about. Before going through what these battles have in common, there is something that has to be said about what they actually were. Every pivot in this series, every moment where the outcome turned, could have gone the other way. The arrow at Hastings could have missed. The storm that scattered the Armada might not have come. The gap in the Persian center at Gaugamela might have closed before Alexander reached it. The German horses might not have died in August. Each of these events in the moment it happened was contingent. It was not decided. He had no predetermined direction. Once the path forecloses, the alternatives disappear. What's left looks like it was always going to happen that way, but we read it backward from the outcome, and the outcome looks like design. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is what human minds do with sequences of events that had no author. The brain finds the pattern. The brain names the agent. The brain calls it fate. This is why the belief in destiny keeps getting produced across every culture and every century, even after it fails so reliably. Not because people are foolish, but because random events after the fact looked exactly like fate. The machinery that generates the belief is the same machinery that allows human beings to function at all. It will keep running as long as the species does. With that in mind, here is what the moments actually were. At Marathon, an Athenian general named Miltiades convinced the war council to attack first, to charge across the plain at the larger Persian army instead of waiting for it to deploy. He had one vote out of 11. The council was deadlocked. The polemarch, the man with the casting vote, was named Callimachus. Miltiades took him aside and talked. We don't know what they said to each other. We know that Callimachus voted to attack. The classical age of Greece, the philosophy, the drama, the political experiments that produce our entire idea of citizenship was made possible by a private conversation between two men whose words were not recorded. At Gaugamela, Alexander waited until a gap opened in the Persian center. Not a gap in the formation, a gap in the timing. The Persian cavalry on the wings was committed, and for a moment the center had nobody behind it. Alexander charged, personally, with the companion cavalry, straight at Darius. The Persian king fled, and an empire that stretched from Egypt to India came apart in a single afternoon, because a 25-year-old had the patience to wait for a window of perhaps 10 minutes and the nerve to ride through it. At Cannae, Hasdrubal's cavalry destroyed the Roman cavalry opposite, then rode around the back of the Roman army and hit it from behind. If Hasdrubal had fought to the bitter end instead of breaking off and wheeling, the Roman infantry escapes. Hannibal does not encircle them. Rome does not lose 50,000 men in an afternoon. The trajectory of Roman history pivots on the discipline of one cavalry commander following a plan. At Hastings, William's Norman cavalry made 3 charges against the English shield wall and failed all 3. The Norman invasion of England, the creation of the English language as we know it, all of it nearly ended in noon on October 14, 1066. What turned the day was an English overreach. Part of the shield wall broke ranks to chase the Normans down the hill. The line opened. The cavalry came back. 1 arrow. The most consequential battle in English history hinged on a piece of indiscipline by a tired man on a slope. At Hattin in 1187, the Crusader king Guy of Lusignan held a council the night before at Saphuria, where the springs were. His most experienced commander told him plainly, leaving the water in July will destroy us. A rival called him a coward and demanded an advance. Guy ordered the march. The Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, nearly a century old, was broken the next afternoon. The Spanish Armada was scattered by a North Atlantic storm in August 1588, after English fire ships at Calais had broken its formation. The largest fleet of the early modern age, blessed by the Pope, was destroyed by weather and by English captains who had spent their careers figuring out that long-range gunnery beats boarding actions. At Saratoga, a British general named Burgoyne marched south from Canada with an army he believed could not be beaten by a colonial militia. He outrun his supply line, walked into New York wilderness, found himself surrounded by farmers who could shoot, and surrendered nearly 6,000 regulars to an army that had not existed 2 years before. France entered the war openly. Without their intervention, there is no American victory. At the Marne in 1914, the German First Army wheeled inward and exposed its flank to the Paris garrison. The wheel was ordered because the supply situation was breaking down. The supply situation was breaking down because the German horses were dying of exhaustion and thirst in the August heat. The shape of the war, and with it the conditions that helped produce the Russian Revolution and the rise of fascism, was set in part by the condition of cavalry horses in late August 1914. At Stalingrad, a Soviet general named Vasily Chuikov decided, against doctrine, to grip the Germans so close that the Luftwaffe could not bomb the Soviet positions without bombing the German ones. He called it hugging the enemy. He pulled his men into within 50 meters of the German lines and held them there for 4 months. The Sixth Army of the Wehrmacht wore itself out. While the Germans were grinding, Zhukov assembled the encirclement that would trap them. At Normandy, the German panzer reserves did not move on the morning of June 6, 1944, because the German High Command was still half convinced that Normandy was a feint. 3 divisions that could have driven the beaches into the sea sat where they were. By the time the order came, it was too late, and it was late afternoon. Allied aircraft were owning the sky. The future of Western Europe turned on the German command's failure to recognize in the first 8 hours what was happening in front of them. None of these moments were inevitable. They were small things taken or missed by specific men who could have done otherwise. A boat, a 10-minute gap, an arrow, a king's decision in a tent, a storm, exhausted horses, a general who hugged the enemy, a high command that refused to see. That is what these battles share. Not size, not heroism, not ideology. They have moments, and moments do not believe in fate. Look at the list of winners: Miltiades, Themistocles, Alexander, Scipio. However, I say Scipio because of my Italian roots. Charles Martel, Saladin. The English captains of 1588, Jan Sobieski, Washington and Greene, Wellington, Meade, Joffre, Zhukov and Chuikov, Eisenhower and Bradley. Not nationality, not religion, not method. Some won with cavalry, some with ships, some with infantry, some with cannon, some from the air. They have nothing in common in any of the obvious ways, but they share one thing in how they fought. They did not assume they would win. Themistocles argued at Salamis from a position of fear. He knew that in open water the Persians would overwhelm them with numbers. He won the argument by threatening to leave with the Athenian fleet if the others refused to fight in the Narrows. That is not the behavior of a man who believes the gods will deliver. That is the behavior of a man who believes his city will be destroyed if he loses this argument. Eisenhower wrote a note on the night before D-Day saying that if the invasion failed, the failure was his alone. Wellington at Waterloo said the battle was the nearest run thing he ever saw. Zhukov, the most successful general of the largest war in human history, wrote in his memoirs that he was afraid every day. These were not modest men. Several were vain, difficult, and spent the rest of their lives inflating their own roles. What they were not, when making decisions, was confident in their own destiny. The fear made them careful. Now look at the losers. Xerxes brought a throne to Salamis. Napoleon told the staff at Waterloo that the battle would be the affair of a breakfast. Lee sent 15,000 men across an open field at Gettysburg because he was sure the Union center would break. Hitler refused to authorize a withdrawal from Stalingrad because his armies, he believed, did not retreat. And the narrative was not invented after the defeat to explain it. It was running before the battle, shaping every decision that led to it. Xerxes built the throne before the fleet sailed. The Spanish named their fleet the most fortunate Armada before it left harbor. The Crusaders had Hattin marched into the desert carrying the true cross as a guarantee of divine protection. Hitler told his generals what the Soviet campaign would prove before the first tank crossed the border. The German timetable that produced the Marne was written years in advance by men who believed France would collapse on schedule. The belief was not a rationalization of the outcome. It was the operating system that produced it. There is a third type the series keeps brushing against but never names, not the destiny believer and not the careful tactician, the visionary. The destiny believer thinks the outcome is already written and he is the instrument, the one who studies the ground, reads the immediate situation and responds to it. The visionary does something different. He sees something that does not yet exist and tries to make reality accept it. Themistocles, Saladin, Lincoln at his most radical, Alexander in certain moods, these are not men who believed history had already chosen them. They believed history could be made into something new if the conditions were right, and they studied the conditions obsessively to find out whether they were. The destiny believer is passive toward reality. The visionary is in a negotiation with it. The distinction matters because it explains something the binary model does not. Some of the losers in this series, the ones we call losers because they lost the battle, won the longer argument. Hannibal lost at Zama. His tactical idea, the double envelopment, is still taught at every military academy on Earth. It was used at Cannae in 216 BC and at Tannenberg in 1914. Napoleon lost at Waterloo. The Napoleonic Code runs through the legal system of France, Spain, Italy, Quebec, and Louisiana today. The man lost. The idea negotiated its own separate peace with reality and survived. The visionaries who succeeded held two things simultaneously, the vision and the ground, the direction and the doubt. Themistocles' genius was not just the vision of Athens as a naval power. It was building the fleet years before the Persians arrived, maneuvering a fractious war council into fighting in the Narrows, and luring Xerxes into a channel where his numbers became his problem. Saladin's genius was not just the vision of reclaiming Jerusalem. It was 15 years of patience before Hattin, unifying Syria and Egypt, neutralizing rivals, waiting for the moment before he allowed himself the battle that ended the Crusader kingdoms. Lincoln's genius was not just the conviction that a nation half slave and half free could not endure. It was the willingness to change generals, absorb defeats, and time the Emancipation Proclamation not when it was morally convenient, but when the military ground would support it. All three had the direction. All three kept checking whether the conditions still allowed it. The visionaries who failed let the vision swallow the ground reading. They had the picture of the future so clearly in their heads that they stopped checking whether the conditions still supported it. When they stopped checking, they became functionally destiny believers. The vision that had been a hypothesis about what reality might accept became a certainty about what reality must accept. That is the moment of conversion. That is when they started losing. Alexander after Gaugamela is the cleanest example in the series. Before Gaugamela, he read every campaign with precision. Terrain, logistics, enemy psychology, his own army's limits. After Gaugamela, after the empire fell in a single afternoon, he seems to have concluded that reality had decided to cooperate with him permanently. The campaigns Bactria and India were run by a man who no longer seriously entertained the possibility that the ground would push back. The ground pushed back. He died at 32 in Babylon with no succession plan and an empire that dissolved inside a generation. The vision was real. The empire he created was real. What he could not survive was Alexander confusing the vision with the outcome. There is something underneath all of this that the series has circled without landing on directly. The wars in these 16 battles were not primarily caused by bad epistemology. They were not the result of leaders who have made better decisions with a clearer head. Most of them were caused by something older and simpler, men who wanted territory, resources, power, or dominion, and who needed a justification large enough to send other men to die for it. The destiny narrative, the gods, the cross, the nation, the race, the revolution, is almost always downstream of that. It gets manufactured to cover something that existed before it. This is the darkest thread in the series, and I want to say it plainly. The machinery of war requires a story. Without a story large enough to justify the cost, you cannot fill the ranks. You cannot sustain the march. You cannot keep sending men forward after the first wave doesn't come back. The story has to be bigger than the individual life being spent. It has to be sacred or inevitable or both. Greed alone cannot produce that story. Conquest dressed only as conquest runs out of willing bodies. But here is where it gets harder than simple cynicism. Not every story was false. Not every leader was a cynic performing belief he did not hold. Washington believed the republic was worth the cost of the war. Lincoln believed that a nation half slave, half free could not endure. And he was right. Chuikov, defending Stalingrad building by building, believed that what was behind him was worth what it cost him to hold. Some of those beliefs were not only sincere, some of them were correct. This is the genuine complication. The same machinery that sent men to die for the vanity of a king also sent men to die for the abolition of slavery. The same structure that dressed conquest in theology also dressed the genuine liberation in the same clothes. From the outside, the two are almost indistinguishable. Both require the story. Both required the man at the bottom to believe in something larger than his own survival. Both produce the same dead. And the man at the top, whether he is the cynical king or the sincere revolutionary, is almost always some mixture of both. And at some point along the way loses the ability to tell the difference in himself. The genuine belief and the hunger for power do not cancel each other out. They coexist. They feed each other. The revolutionary who began by meaning it discovers that power is intoxicating. The king who began by taking discovers that he needs to believe in something larger. The categories collapse. What does not collapse is the structure. The people who decide pay at a different rate than the people who execute. That has been true at every battle in this series without exception. From the Persian rower at Salamis to the boy from Yorkshire off the landing craft at Gold Beach, it is not a coincidence, it is a feature. The distance between decision and consequence is not a side effect of the machinery, it is what allows the machinery to run. There is a thing the losers in this series do after they lose. It is the same thing in every century we have records for. They try to put the destiny back in. Hannibal, after Zama, fled into exile. He spent the rest of his life moving from court to court. Antiochus of Syria, Prusias of Bithynia, offering himself as an advisor to anyone who still hired the man who had nearly broken Rome. At the end, when the Romans were closing in to demand his extradition, he killed himself with poison he had kept in a ring for exactly this purpose. He was gone before he was 70. The double envelopment he invented was used at Tannenberg 21 centuries later. Napoleon at Waterloo was sent to St. Helena. He spent 6 years in a damp house on a rock in the South Atlantic, dictating his memoirs. In those memoirs, Waterloo was lost because of bad weather, because of treachery, because of Grouchy's failure to arrive. Napoleon was never at fault. The empire had been the rightful order of Europe. History had been cheated by accidents and lesser men. He died still dictating. The legal code he had built was already being copied by half the civilized world. The Kaiser, after the war he had launched in 1914, had destroyed his throne, his army and his country, lived in exile in the Netherlands for 23 years, splitting wood in the garden of his castle at Doorn and writing pamphlets blaming the Jews, the Socialists and the British. He never publicly acknowledged that he had ordered the war. Hitler in the bunker dictated a political testament in which the German people had failed him. The race had been weak, the generals had betrayed him, Providence had been thwarted by the inadequacy of the instrument. He shot himself the next day. This is the genre. The loser sits in defeat and rewrites the destiny back in. The fate was real. Something interfered. What is worth sitting with is the gap between the man and the idea. Napoleon failed. The code survived him. Hannibal failed. The envelopment survived him. The man on the rock, the man in the garden, the man in the bunker. None of them could see which parts of what they had built were real and which parts were the story they had told themselves to justify the building. They went to their deaths inside the story. The verdict on the idea was still being written. The estimated dead across the 16 battles in this series, just the battles themselves, not the wars they were part of, is somewhere between 2 and 3 million human beings. The wars they were part of killed many tens of millions more. Most of the men who died had no idea what they were fighting for in any sense that would survive a serious question. Most of them were conscripted or pressed or marched in by the customs of their time. Most did not live to find out whether their side won. The Persian rower at Salamis, drowning in armor in a strait he did not know the name of, paid for the survival of Greek democracy. He did not know what he was paying for. He had been told he was paying for the glory of the King of Kings. The Carthaginian infantryman at Cannae surrounding a Roman force he believed was about to be wiped out forever, paid for 2 more centuries of Punic resistance and eventually destruction of his city. He had been told he was paying for Hannibal's vengeance. The English archer on the ridge at Hastings, dying in the dusk as the Norman cavalry came back through the broken line, paid for the English language, the common law, the parliamentary tradition. He had been told he was paying to keep a Saxon king on his throne. The Russian rifleman in the rubble of Stalingrad, the boy from Yorkshire who drowned off a landing craft at Gold Beach. None of them knew what the consequences of their deaths would be. They paid anyway. The honest accounting has to include them, but the honest accounting also has to include this. Some of what they paid for was real. The defeat of the Wehrmacht was worth what it cost, because the alternative was a price nobody wants to calculate. The survival of Athenian democracy at Salamis produced something that did not exist before and that we are still living inside. The abolition of slavery required a war that killed 600,000 Americans, and the honest question is not whether the price was too high, but whether there was any other way to pay it. And the honest answer is probably not. The problem is not that prices are never worth paying. The problem is that nobody in the moment can know whether the ledger will balance. The man deciding cannot know. The man dying cannot know. They both operate inside a story that hasn't ended yet. The consequences of Salamis were not visible at Salamis. The consequences of Gettysburg were not visible at Gettysburg. The full verdict of Normandy, what Europe it produced becomes, is not in yet. When we say that a battle was consequential, what we're saying is that a great many specific human beings, most of them young, most of them frightened, most of them with families they had not seen for months, died for a purpose whose value they could not verify at the time and may not have believed in entirely even then. That is what consequential means. That is the price. So why does the machinery keep running? Why does every generation produce more believers if the belief fails them so reliably? Because the belief does not update when it fails. In closing, my dear friends, this series was made over 20 weeks by one person, working at a kitchen table in Minnesota, mostly on weekends, with a microphone, a camera, some books, and lots of research. I'm not a historian by training. I have a day job that has nothing to do with any of this. I made this series because the battles in it have been on my mind for years, and I made it for the people who will watch it. And I made it mostly for my two children, who will be old enough one day to ask me what I think about history, and I would rather they had this than my answer at the dinner table. I want to say clearly what I was trying to do and what I was not. I was not trying to argue for an ideology. I was not trying to say that one system of government produces better outcomes than another, or that one set of values is right and another is wrong, or that history is moving in a direction I approve and you should too. Every series that claims to be objective is made by a person with a vantage point, and mine is this. A man in his 40s watching these battles from 40,000 feet and several centuries of distance. That distance gives me patterns I could not see from inside the events. It also means I will never fully know what it felt like to be standing in a field at Gettysburg in July, or gripping a rifle in the rubble at Stalingrad in November, or rowing in a strait at Salamis 2,500 years ago. The view from 40,000 feet is real. It is also partial. What I can say honestly from that distance is this. The animal making the decisions has not changed. Xerxes and Hitler are not separated by 24 centuries of moral evolution. They're the same type, with different equipment, the hunger for dominion, the need to dress that hunger in something sacred. The manufacture of a story large enough to send other men's children to die. These are not historical artifacts. They are operating right now in the world this episode is being released into, on every side of every current conflict without any exception. Every regime currently sending other people's children to die is doing so under some version of the destiny argument. Every one of them will say the cause is righteous, that history demands it, that the alternative is unthinkable. Many of them will say God has chosen their side. That has been true across every century in this series. It is true right now. Some of them believe it sincerely, some do not. The dead are the same either way, and yet I cannot end there because ending there is also dishonest. Some of those causes were real. Some of those stories underneath the machinery pointed at something true. Defeating the Wehrmacht was not the same as being or acting like the Wehrmacht. The survival of Athens was not equivalent to the Persian conquest it survived. There are distinctions that matter, and pretending they are not, it is its own kind of comfortable lie. The cynic's version of the destiny narrative, equally resistant to evidence. Here is the thing I keep coming back to. Every man in this series who made the large decisions, who ordered the march, sent the fleet, launched the offensive, died without knowing the full verdict of what he had done. Lincoln was shot 5 days after Appomattox. Napoleon dictated his memoirs without knowing whether the Napoleonic Code would survive him. Chuikov held Stalingrad without knowing what the Soviet state he was saving would become in the decades after. They all died inside the middle of the story, not at the end of it. And I genuinely wonder what that moment is like. Not the public death, not the recorded last words, but the last second of consciousness for a man who spent his life making decisions that cost other people their lives. Whether the picture clears, whether the belief holds, or turns into something else entirely. In the face of the one thing that makes all arguments stop, maybe it dissolves. Maybe the story that held everything together comes apart in the last moment, and what's left is just the raw number, the dead, the specific phases, the particular cost, without the justification that made it bearable. Maybe it does neither. Maybe the last second is just a last second and the picture does not clear because the picture was never going to clear, because the story is still going and the verdict on what any of these men built or destroyed is still being written by the people who came after them and the people who will come after us. I think that last one is probably right, but I cannot be certain and I will not pretend to be. What I can say is this: the series found patterns, the same vanities, the same self-deceptions, the same manufacture of destiny across every century we have records for. But he also found exceptions, men who held the vision and the doubt simultaneously, moments where the contingent event went the other way and the world that followed was genuinely better for it, ideas that survived the men who held them and came back under different names, a generation or a century later. History is not a story being told by anyone. It is not going anywhere in particular. There is no arc, no plan, no power above the human level curating events for moral effect. What there is, in the meantime, is a few 100,000 human beings scattered across geography and millennia, making their own small decisions under their own particular pressures, and the decisions adding up in ways nobody predicted and nobody fully understands afterwards. Some of those decisions were made by men who studied the ground. Some were made by men who studied the omens. The ones who studied the ground won more often. Some of what they built was worth the price. Some was not. And the people paying the price, in most cases, could not tell the difference at the time, and neither can we entirely from here. That is the honest account. That is what you get from 40,000 feet and 25 centuries. When somebody tells you in your own time that history has chosen their side or that the cause cannot fail, remember the 16 battles. Remember that every single losing commander in the series believed exactly what that person is telling you now. Remember what happened to them. Then ask what idea is underneath the story, whether it is real, whether the price being asked is proportionate to it, whether the people asking you to pay it are paying anything themselves. Those are the questions the series cannot answer for you. They are yours to confront. They are the ones that matter. Study the ground. Thank you for watching this series, and I will see you on the next one. Goodbye.